Good evening, everybody. Bonjour, bonjour, tansi, and greetings. Welcome to the webinar series on the proposed K-12 education reform, and specifically Bill 64, the Education Modernization Act. These events are hosted by the University of Manitoba and the University of Winnipeg Faculties of Education, and we collectively welcome you here tonight. My name is Melanie Janzen. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba, and it is my great pleasure to be your host tonight for our second of a series of forums regarding Bill 64. And I hope everyone can hear me, otherwise I'm feeling like I'm talking to myself. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the university campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. For those of you who are joining us from treaty territories or unceded lands elsewhere, I invite you to acknowledge those lands in the chat. I would also like to point out that June is National Indigenous History Month in Canada, and that Monday, June 21st, is National Indigenous Peoples Day. The territorial acknowledgement, as well as those national events, are moments in which we might and should reflect and act on the negotiated agreement of the treaties. Important to note that the land that many of us are, that we work and live on here tonight, Treaty 1, were negotiated and entered into in 1871, 150 years ago this summer, along with Treaty 2, actually. For those of you who may not know, Treaties 1 and 2 cover much of southern Manitoba, from the 49th parallel to the provincial border of Saskatchewan and almost to Ontario, where Treaty 3 is, and up north, covering many communities near Lakes Winnipeg and Manitoba. I am reminded by the Anishinaabe Métis legal scholar, Amy Craft, that treaties are about relationships that are built on respect and that need tending to so that they can last as long as the grass grows, the sun shines, and the rivers flow. We are indeed all treaty people. And I invite all of us to reflect on, consider, and engage in actions related to those relationships. Before I introduce to you the panel of presenters for tonight's webinar, I'd like to give you just a bit of context of the webinar so far. In fact, we have 5 planned in the series. Part 1 was held last week, and as you noted in the chat, is now posted on our faculty's YouTube channel. Part 3 is on June 24th around conceptualizations of student, teachers, and learning. Part 4 will be July 8th, and Part 5 on July 15th. We will likely have more after that. I'd also like to draw your attention to a soon to be posted website called InformEd. And this is a website that's dedicated to contributing insights, opinions, and research from researchers in all of the universities in Manitoba about public education. And of course, we will focus initially on Bill 64. And now for our panel presentation. Tonight's focus is on policy, inclusion, and Indigenous education. I'd like to introduce you to our 3 panelists tonight. Dr. Jeannie Kerr from the University of Winnipeg, who's going to be talking about what's not in the bill. Dr. Kerr is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Winnipeg. Her research examines the reproduction of societal inequalities through K-12 schooling and higher education, and considers ways in which both teacher education and higher education can engage complexity, uncertainty, and diversity so as to address local and global inequalities. Dr. Lesley Eblie Trudel will be talking about education that includes everyone. Dr. Eblie Trudel has been involved in public education for over 30 years, and most recently as an assistant superintendent of schools. In January 2019, she joined the Faculty of Education at the University of Winnipeg. Currently Associate Dean in the faculty, Dr. Eblie Trudel is a collaborative leader and interdisciplinary researcher with a keen interest in organizational learning and systemic change as it pertains to diverse, inclusive educational communities. And third, Dr. Frank Deer, who will be speaking about Indigenous education in Bill 64. Dr. Deer is an associate professor, Canada Research Chair at the University of Manitoba's Faculty of Education, and a member of the Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Deer studies Indigenous language education, and his current scholarship is moving in the direction of philosophy of education and religious studies. We have asked each presenter to speak for about 20 minutes, after which time we will open the conversation for a short Q&A. I ask that you please use the Q&A function and not the chat to submit your questions, and I will do my best to sort through them and pose them to our panelists. At the end of the session, I'll also provide you with a few more resources that you might want to use as we all continue to understand the proposed legislative reform and the effects that it may have on our democracy. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Jeannie Kerr.
Good evening, everybody. This is a little surreal. So yeah, I'm really honored to be here tonight. I'm honored for the invitation and to be part of an important conversation that's going on in Manitoba. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen and let's hope it all works. There we go. So yeah, my presentation is going to be focusing on what's not in Bill 64. So as Dr. Jensen met in her great introduction, I'd just like to thank her for acknowledging territory and inviting us all to do the same. I think with the particular theme of tonight's talk, it becomes even more important to really recognize our responsibilities that come with being on Indigenous territory and being part of treaties. So I'd like to thank her for that and acknowledge the water coming from Shoal Lake First Nations 40 into Treaty 1 territory as well. So tonight what I'm going to talk about is really thinking about the context. I'll start with what's there and what's being said in Bill 64, as well as that BEST, unfortunate acronym for the plans that also came out of the review that are really linked to Bill 64. So in terms of my own background, just so you have a context for that as well, I have been a classroom teacher in the downtown east side of Vancouver for 12 years and learned a lot from what an enriched, vibrant community can really do to influence education. And, you know, I've brought that with me to my work and my research, looking really at inner city landscapes and how inequalities get reproduced within systems and through education, and how we can look to community to really think about how we can restructure these systems. So as we look at Bill 64, what's there? What's the stated commitment is right in the preamble, best interest of students and parents. But I draw your attention to really that those people are positioned as individuals and not as members of communities. There's a kind of a very generalized foci on inclusion and student belonging, parents being active, language rights that are pretty exclusive for only French and English speakers, and advancing reconciliation, which is framed completely in terms of Indigenous children's success, measured in predominantly graduation rates. So that's the commitment. And then there's this sort of technocratic BEST framework that comes out that talks about very neoliberal kind of accountability for results, outcomes, getting students ready to participate in global capital society, and then how we're going to structure leadership to enact all of this. So what's silent, what's absent in Bill 64? So I'm going to talk about these 4 things today. The first one is poverty as fundamental to educational outcomes. That's very invisible within this bill. Systemic racism and how it exists within our institutions and education, and again, how that's not being addressed. Community-based collective engagement and the wisdom that they have not being addressed, and recognition of settler colonialism as the organizing feature in North America for how education gets enacted almost identically across the continent. So poverty and education, I saw Jim Silver's very immediate response, you know, as a, I admire the work he's done over a long period of time and have had a chance to get to know him since I've been here. I moved to Winnipeg 5 years ago. So in the quote, virtually all rigorous studies across the world over decades have reached the same conclusion: the most powerful predictor of educational outcomes is economic status. So you know, that's pretty indisputable. That came out, the link between SES and social economic status and educational outcomes was first reported as a real and recognized in 1966 as a real fundamental problem. So it's not that this is, you know, a new thing, but it is noticeably absent as a real focus in this bill. If we look at how poverty is working in Manitoba in particular, these are child poverty rates, and Manitoba is, you know, the highest province in child poverty, well above the national average and second only to Nunavut. So a lot of, there's a great book, the little reference is there at the bottom, but it was called a publication, Broken Promises, Stolen Futures, Child and Family Poverty in Manitoba. And that was done by Campaign 2000 and Child and Family Poverty just last year. And, you know, it's based off, there was this, you know, federal commitment to end child poverty by the year 2000. We're literally 20 years later with very little progress. So within this bill, the only way that poverty is kind of mentioned is there's a little bit on community schools. So there used to be a Community Schools Act, and it's now just like a paragraph in the new bill. And it talks about inequitable context and how that should be addressed, but there's absolutely no funding and no required structure for how that is going to happen. There's just examples of what community schools can do in a philosophy. Within the best practices, there's or BEST, whatever that acronym for that strategy is that, you know, it basically acknowledges it, but does so within a very individualized way, and framing it that, you know, education is something that will pull you out of poverty rather than something that's been reproducing it over decades. The second major absence is any discussion of systemic racism and how that relates to racialized poverty. So again, from the Broken Promises, Stolen Future book, relying on Stats Canada data, that child poverty in Manitoba is completely racialized. So with the people, you know, that have experiencing the highest levels of poverty are First Nations on reserve, off reserve, newer immigrants, and racialized individuals. So that there's definitely a pattern, and that Bill 64 doesn't acknowledge that pattern at all. So a dear friend, Fadia Nab, had a recent article in Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And it's, you know, he noted so clearly that Bill 64 fails to explicitly deal with systemic issues and inequalities, and the proposed changes actually undermine and dilute community voice in speaking back to these inequalities. So in that way, this bill becomes repositioned to just, you know, like reconstitute the inequalities by ignoring them. So another study, with another dear friend and colleague, Dr. Isul Yoon, notes the spatial segregation of poverty and student mobility. So this is specifically in Winnipeg. So these are maps of Winnipeg, and what these maps represent, the first one on the left of the screen, so those bars, the little black bars, represent student mobility. So mobility is an unplanned change of school. And there's, you know, decades again of evidence that student mobility is negatively associated with academic outcomes. So we know these two things are happening. So what this map tries to do is really map this in a specific location within Manitoba, in this case, Winnipeg. And you can see the dark blue areas are some of the lowest income areas in the city, where there's, you know, very concentrated high rates of poverty, and those map right onto to high mobility. And then the very red areas map areas of incredible affluence, which again maps onto incredible low mobility. And we see the academic outcomes are very associated with that. On the right is another map, and this one reflects Indigenous representation within Winnipeg. So there's a real, you can see there's a real overlap in terms of high poverty and Indigenous representation and high mobility and academic outcomes. So we know these things are complexly related. There's no very specific cause and effect, but we can see that there's a spatialized effect that's going on that needs to be considered and thought about deeply in our education system. And Bill 64 has no analysis and no thought, not even a platitude really in the preamble about what this means. And these are some of the factors that are really behind some of the deepest inequalities in our educational system. So I want to be really careful here because I know there's some people that have very explicit deficit attitudes towards inner city communities and Indigenous and racialized people. And I would highlight very strongly that these communities are resurging against the systems that are trying very, you know, in multiple ways and surrounding the communities in terms of barriers, lack of access, and the communities resurge against this. So that this is not a way that we should ever be looking at this kind of data and saying that this is somehow the fault of the community. And I would be really more explicit again in terms of that best booklet. It's really like poverty and individualism and meritocracy are really joined tightly in the language of that booklet. And it really does have a deficit framing that kind of looks at people who are experiencing poverty as somehow at fault for their poverty rather than settler colonialism, land dispossession, economic barriers and segregations in a city. And we can see that, you know, this is Winnipeg school division data, and this is early years literacy and numeracy, and the most explicitly influenced people to all of these systems in terms of their academic outcomes are Indigenous newcomers and children in child and family services. I would really put care in quotes because you know, they experience some of the worst outcomes within the educational system. And again, I would shift some of the language, and I talk about outcomes because a lot of the bill talks about outcomes, but I would say sometimes they look at these things and as academic or outcome gaps or educational gaps, and I would call these opportunity gaps, following a lot of important scholars who talk about what's not there, what supports aren't there that are causing these results. And I am really influenced, a recent colleague, Dr. Mark Cooley, at his defense, there was a really robust discussion with Dr. Janzen and Dr. Dwayne Donald and Dr. Mark Cooley about really like what kind of success for Indigenous students when the whole system is designed in a sense not to honor your culture. So, you know, how is just assimilating and being successful in the measures of that system a good thing? And I think it's something that should be something we're really talking about, but this bill is not. The other piece that I would say is a huge omission is the individualized nature of how people are positioned. So as I was saying, parents are positioned as individuals, students as individuals. They aren't positioned as members of communities. So that kind of individualistic framing really discounts what community members and what it means to be in a collective and experiencing the exclusions and barriers collectively that you want to speak back to, having that disabled, and drawing back to Fadia Nab's analysis that the voices have become watered down incredibly within this bill, so that we can see there's very little voice and there's very little opportunity for collective voice within the proposed structures that are being, especially the 15 catchment areas and one voice representing from each, and how many students that and communities that need voice are then diluted from that. I would also highlight the ability, like the communities have lived experience that could actually address some of these problems because they understand them deeply, because they've had to research against them, and that it would be, you know, the first place to look for how we should be reforming the system, and the first people to and communities to partner with. But that hasn't been the priority within this bill. Just to acknowledge the much larger context as well of settler colonialism. So I've been following the work of Heather Dories, who is an urban geographer, and you know, that we don't really talk about this stuff widely within educational talk and systems, but you know, within settler colonialism, that's a governance structure we're working in, and in that sense, the colonizing force doesn't leave, but seeks to replace Indigenous societies. So the way that we talk about it in, I think, across North America and settler nation states globally as well, is it's just naturalized of the settler entitlement to live in futurity on Indigenous territories, with just kind of erasing that's happened, that's going on, and the continuing violence that happens. So these systems are based on Euro-Western ontologies that authorize certain kinds of social life that align with those ontologies. So when we can see that people who are not within those ontologies and communities, then, you know, that becomes much more understandable. So in that way, even the title of modernization positions itself within a long-standing colonial relationship, where that kind of progress, and we're getting better, and all of these kind of things, this futuristic, you know, unidirectional narrative to the future, to this ideal place, is centered without having any room to discuss the violence that's occurred for that society to exist. So in that terms, I follow like Walter Mignolo about the shine and the shadow of settler colonial societies. So I guess for Bill 64, I see it as replicating a lot of existing inequalities that are already going on. So the exclusions more so than the inclusions. So the inclusions are a little bit flat. You know, Sarah Med has a term called nonperformatives, where you say something and it means that you've done it already. So you say, oh, I'm anti-racist, means you're an anti-racist, right? But those are non-performatives. They don't do anything because you're just saying things. And I feel like this bill is really just saying things about inclusion and things like that. But the structure of it makes it a non-performative. It can't do what it's saying it's going to do, because it's replicating all of the problems that are already existing and narrating them in a way that makes them impossible to address. So I look at, obviously, Bill 64, a lot of people, I mean, it has a lot of problems in terms of being anti-democratic and the structures and how it treats the people that working and living within those structures. But yeah, I think in terms of my view on, you know, like equity and inclusion and decolonization, I'm not sure we even have time to unpack that. I think this bill is, you know, a profound failure. So I think I would like to leave more time to talk about some of these things, because I know I raise a lot of stuff that people may not have, you know, been really deeply involved in that conversation before. So yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Jeannie. I really appreciate your attention to what was not in the bill, and I think that's very telling as to what we can expect, obviously. There was a question in the Q&A, which you don't need to respond to, but it was an encouragement to propose or to share your presentation at the Legislative Bill Committee on Bill 64. So just to let you know, people are quite pleased with what you had to present. And in regards to, and I shouldn't say please perhaps, but they think, you know, you're pointing out important aspects of the bill that are obviously missing. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Now we'll turn to Dr. Eblie Trudel. Lesley, you there?
I am here, thank you.
Great.
Just going to share my screen as well. Hopefully everyone can see that. All right, and we'll get started here. So thank you very much, Dr. Kerr, Jeannie, and thank you very much for the kind introduction, Dr. Janzen. As Dr. Janzen mentioned, I'm here with you this evening to share my academic and research perspectives on the proposed education reform as it pertains specifically to education for all students. I will also address the need for change and the topic of change in general as it relates to education reform. And I'm going to begin by also acknowledging that the University of Winnipeg, where I conduct my research, is in Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, the Dakota and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis. And our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. And I want to acknowledge that we mourn and honor the 215 children found buried in the Kamloops residential school site and the countless many more, both known and still unknown, who have lost their lives or have had their lives damaged because of the residential school system. With knowledge of the colonial harms of the past, it goes without saying that change must be non-negotiable. We also know that change is an essential part of human growth and learning. I would also add that this is relevant not only for individuals, as Dr. Kerr noted, but can be extended to organizations and communities as well. And when we consider education, I believe you would find that most in our province support the need for some degree of change. In fact, when given the opportunity, countless recommendations were submitted to the Manitoba's government K-12 review, represented in this slide by the graphic on the left. I actually provided a submission on behalf of the Student Services Administrators Association of Manitoba, a second based on research that I had conducted in regard to education funding for students with additional needs. And I also participated in a third submission with the Inclusive Professors Roundtable. And those submissions and all others were to be reviewed by the Commission. Their report was set to be released in March 2020, but was held until March 2021 due to the pandemic. And what followed included a government plan. The proposed plan put forward by the province, represented by the graphic on the right, however, contains only select aspects of the $1 million consultation process. Moreover, it contains what the government considered to be learnings as a result of the inconvenience of dealing with 37 school divisions during the pandemic. Their words, not mine. Accompanying legislation in the form of Bill 64 noted in the center of this slide, as you heard last week, proposes the elimination of democratically elected school boards, the creation of a provincial education authority, school division amalgamations, reducing 37 to 15 regional catchment areas, and limiting principals and vice principals from being in the same bargaining unit as teachers, to name a few of the potential changes. So how did we get here? Is this typical? Has this happened before? Well, there certainly have been many iterations of government-initiated change relating to education over the years, and when it occurs, it affects everyone, especially our students. From the dissolution of Manitoba's dual system of Protestant and Catholic education in 1890 to the unity of school divisions in 1967, the provision of education in Manitoba was traditionally organized on the basis of small school districts. Following along on the timeline in this slide, in 1943, mandatory school attendance was required in Canadian provinces. Well, attendance was mandatory so long as you didn't have special educational needs. Parental and social justice advocacy kickstarted the first schools for students with special needs, but that wasn't until the early 1950s. Mind you, those schools were largely segregated and separate at the time. By the 1950s, there were 1,700 small school districts operating in Manitoba, served by single schools. Department of Education inspectors were concerned about the lack of library facilities, lack of equipment for science labs, playground, and the high number playground equipment, and the high number of non-certified teachers. At this time, there was also a change in expectation for all students, as they would be required to complete secondary education as an essential tenet of life. Due to the poor examination results from most high schools, however, Premier Douglas Campbell invoked the first Royal Commission on Education in 1957. The final report was released in 1959 and concluded that if substantial changes to the organization of school districts must be made, quote, if the children of the province were to be provided with anything approaching equality of educational opportunity, end quote. At the time, there were concerns over increased costs, loss of local autonomy, and closure of small schools, very similar to what we're hearing. Several years later, Premier Duff-Roblin's Conservative government acted on the Commission's recommendations, which proposed to the government of the day that 46 school divisions be created from the 1,700 small school districts. And by the late 1960s, the transformation to fewer than 60 school divisions was complete. For the next 40 years, the administrative terrain of public education in Manitoba would remain largely unchanged. Remember that during all of the change process, the Public Schools Act remained, and periodic amendments were made incrementally to modernize structure, approach, and strategy. From 1970 on, we saw public school enrollment decreasing, as you can see in this graph. And Manitoba again established a Boundaries Review Commission known as the Nori Commission in 1993 under the Conservative government of Gary Filmon. During the mid to late 1990s, provincial government funding was frozen or reduced, and yet system-wide expenditure levels continued to increase and overall cost of education grew in spite of declining enrollments. To backfill this reduction in provincial support, local boards resorted to reductions in staffing. Sounds familiar. At the time, politicians contended that having 11 school divisions in Winnipeg was unnecessary, particularly when cities of similar sizes had far fewer. Again, sounds familiar. Education Minister at the time, Linda McIntosh, said, "We cannot allow fear to prevent us from making improvements in our system. We must be bold enough to display strong leadership at a time when ambivalence and stationary inertia are preventing progress," end quote. In spite of the Conservative Education Minister's enthusiasm, Premier Gary Filmon chose not to act on recommendations of the Nori Commission. In fact, it wasn't until the NDP government of Gary Doer did the plan come to fruition. Well, partially. The Commission originally recommended that the number of school divisions be reduced from 57 to 21, and that process should be directed rather than voluntary. And ultimately, the number of school divisions were reduced to 37 in 2002, and the rationale for changes was to achieve significant cost savings and to produce a net educational gain. The establishment and the use of commissions by governments in Canada as a means of receiving, transmitting, and absorbing information and knowledge has had a long and venerable history at both federal and provincial levels. They have performed a number of functions in undertaking their assigned tasks, which include securing information as a basis of policy decisions, educating the public in order to create pressure for possible legislation, permitting the airing of conflicting values, and also sampling public opinion before decisions are actually made. They can also be used to allow the government to postpone decision-making on issues which could be negatively impactful. When considering changes of this nature, a government must consider the manner of support on which they can move forward successfully. In 2002, for example, the NDP government did not have the support of the school boards, the superintendents, the parent councils, or the school business officials when it came to school division amalgamations. But it did have the support of teachers. MTS believed that school division amalgamations could result in increased salaries and improved benefits from newly combined collective agreements. Hence, with that base, the government made the decision to move forward with their plan to amalgamate school divisions. I would add that currently I do not see the support of any of the aforementioned organizations behind the proposed Bill 64. Amidst all of the change that I've shared, I can elaborate that there continued to be grassroots advocacy to transform what was seen as education for students with special needs, education of the other. Segregation of the 1950s to 1970s shifted to a more artificial state of mainstreaming or integration prior to Manitoba proclaiming legislation in 2005, which ensured appropriate educational programming for all students. What was once done previously for students when and if convenient was now mandated, and this change in and of itself was, in my opinion, one of the most influential changes in my career in education. The amendments to the Public Schools Act brought education legislation in alignment with provincial human rights codes, Canadian charter law, and it provided school boards the requirement to meet standards respecting resources and support services for all students. A provincial dispute resolution process was also established, and Manitoba is only one of 2 provinces in Canada where this formal process exists. Now, as I mentioned, there are always challenges which require change. Yet, in order for change to truly take course, the other essential context is that the government must be willing to push that agenda over the tipping point and carry forward a proposed solution. Some of the challenges that I experienced and had shared with me over time were as follows. There continue to be indicators of need to focus on equity, inclusion, and diversity in Manitoba. Rampant child poverty, as Dr. Kerr noted, close to 12,000 children in care of child and family services. Education legislation that does require continuous updating and improvement, and a provincial report card that needs to be overhauled to reflect a universal design approach. There were and continue to be financial constraints, including a need to review the financial reporting and accounting in Manitoba education, or the frame document, and also the need to keep up with increasing needs and related costs of supporting all students. And there are ongoing concerns by think tanks, policy institutions, and interest groups. The response from the government was to hear these concerns through an authentic consultation process, to document them, and to make a plan for recommended changes. As I've already mentioned, what followed is quite different. It is with concern that I share the next 2 slides, which the government has created to present a rationale for their proposed plan and legislation. I will draw your attention to the fact that in addition to the 37 school divisions that the government listed as complicated, top-heavy, and unchanged, on the left side of the slide, you will also notice Student Inclusion Supports, Program for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and Manitoba School for the Deaf. In the next slide, the aforementioned items from the list on the left have been removed in the streamlined model. Again, I'm not suggesting that there will not be provisions for equity, diversity, and inclusion, but ominously, they don't appear on any information here. Additionally, there would be no longer a Public Schools Act, as we have noted over the last 130 years, nor would there be an Educational Administration or Community Schools Act. They would be incorporated by the Education Modernization Bill 64. So would it logically follow that there would no longer be appropriate educational program regulations? Well, not necessarily, as legislation contains statutes, regulations, and bylaws. And I have been assured verbally that the regulations for appropriate educational programming and related standards would remain in play, and that new regulations would be made over time by proposed committee structures. And there needs to be a lot of trust in order for that to occur. Keep in mind, however, the government's plan, which accompanies the legislation, has 4 pillars, which do not mention the inclusion of students. It is important to note that in the plan, that the term inclusion is not mentioned in the 10 main imperatives for action. There is a great deal of discussion on performance assessment, data, analytics, accountability, reducing gaps, and much focus on the appointed education authority. provincial councils, and advisory groups. There is a priority under Pillar 2, 2.3 to be exact, which indicates the establishment of a new Ministers' Advisory Council on Inclusive Education to revitalize Manitoba's philosophy of inclusion with a mandate to identify professional learning needs, enhance classroom level supports, as well as strategies to ensure timely assessment, learning supports, and clinical services. With all due respect, that work is being done by educators across the province right now. The structures and strategies that are in place at the current time need to be fortified and supported to move forward. For example, the standards for student services from 2006 have been updated since 2017, yet have not been released yet for implementation. Political scientist and University of Michigan Professor Emeritus John Kingdon suggests that change comes about when three streams connect. First, a condition needs to be defined as a problem, and people must be convinced that something should be done to change it. A problem becomes recognized when the following elements are in play: pervasive and powerful indicators, budgetary woes, and financial constraints, complaints and advocacy by affected and interested parties, and of course, political pressure to invoke change. And then there is politics. This is a quote from former Conservative Education Minister Rosemary Vaudry. She said at the time, quote, "Government is very personal, and much depends upon the minister of the day leading the department and what the minister's personal priorities are. Sometimes things get bumped up and you don't necessarily expect it, but you do come in with your own views. That's why you're put there. You do have, and this is the thing that impressed me about the government, I honestly believe that individual ministers have a great deal of power and influence based on their particular interests, backgrounds, and again, partly on how well they can bring forward issues and how much their colleagues accept what they have to say," end quote. And finally, there are policies, proposed solutions, plans for education reform, and resulting statutes and legislation that must overcome the constraints of cost, public acceptability, and receptivity. Hence, along with other stakeholders in the province, we are left to ask questions about whether the government's plan indeed represents the changes that were recommended by individuals and organizations during what was thought to be an authentic consultation process during the K-12 review. We are left to comparatively interpret what is being put forward and what is needed, and then challenged to speak about or to the proposed legislation in order to ensure that we have done what is ethically necessary on behalf of educators, all students, and families in Manitoba. The literature is clear on important and non-negotiable work of organizational change. Incremental and regular changes built into the fabric of the work that individuals do is most successful and leads to the greatest improvement and gains. The literature refers to this as small wins, which is so incredibly important and necessary for all those in education, especially on the heels of a worldwide pandemic. Thank you to Dr. David Yeo, whose dissertation I analyzed to gain some of the more detailed accounts of government processes and change that I shared with you this evening. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to engage with part 2 of this presentation series.
Thank you, Lesley. And thank you for reminding us about the importance of grassroots community and parental involvement in making change. Indeed, it was because of advocacy that the Inclusive Education Bill came to fruition. And I think that's a powerful reminder of the importance of the democratic system in which we work and the ways in which it does work. So thank you so much. Frank, over to you.
I'll go. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
You're audible.
Okay, can you just stay on for a second? I'm going to share my screen and you will give me the thumbs up to indicate that I have my presentation the way it should be. Now I'll go. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's good to see so many people on the Zoom tonight and on a beautiful perfectly serviceable Thursday evening. I come to you from the Faculty of Education at University of Manitoba. I've been here for about 12 years. I graduated from here in 1999. I entered the field of education initially as an elementary school teacher. I went to the far north for my first job. I basically jumped on the first job I was offered in the Frontier School Division. And I went into it observing what was around me and rather naively thought there had been a great deal of progress, or at least I was in the midst of progress, if you will. You see, this was an era in which post-RCAP, which government at the highest levels didn't demonstrate a whole lot of interest in being terribly responsive to, but many provincial and local initiatives around education did have as an informing set of principles some of what was going on in the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples report and some of the recommendations that were really quite interesting. And what followed that was some initiatives that I thought were really quite interesting. For instance, there was a Native Studies curriculum of a quality and sort that wasn't there before. We was quickly followed by some changes in social studies. I think that might have been 2003, the new curriculum came out where, you know, it wasn't strong compared to now, but there was a great deal going on in that area, and some of the professional development that was going on that was quite nice. And I was working in a school, in a community for which the connection between the Indigenous experience, in this case, the Cree First Nations experience, and the local school, what teachers got up to in that school was really quite close, and the discussions were fecund, and there was a great deal of participation by local figures who had a vested interest because they were sending their most valuable members of their community to us, trusting us to support them and to help them learn. And that was their children, their young children in that case, right? Yet here we are in 2021 with Bill 64 in front of us. I was asked this evening to discuss, if I may put it this way, in what ways are Indigenous education absent from Bill 64? And it's an odd question to address. It's perhaps kind of like responding to a question, in what ways is water absent from the local public pool on a hot July day? You know, well, there should be some, and perhaps we don't realize the gravity of the situation until some young child jumps in, naively trusting that those in charge had done a good job with this public facility. It's been a challenge to kind of try and understand what is going on in Bill 64. Some of the comments that Minister Cullen had picked up on a few days ago, I think it was Monday. If I'm being charitable, and I have to be very charitable to get this far, I think back to an opportunity I had many years ago where I took a graduate class, and class was taught by the then Deputy Minister of Education. I won't name that individual. Made an interesting insight on the back of his experience as Deputy Minister of Education, saying that nothing much gets any serious attention around here unless you can see palpable results in about 18 months at the max, right? I could understand the impulse to address policy in that way at some level, right? We're talking about individuals in what's ostensibly a democratic system for which these issues have to be addressed in such a way that has some sort of political sustainability for them, okay? So if I'm very, very, very charitable, then there's that, I suppose. But that reared its ugly head, that impulse, many years later. It was before the previous, the 2016, I should say, provincial election. I was invited to speak at Maples Collegiate at the election forum on Indigenous education. There was an opportunity to speak. All the party, in two cases, party leaders. In others, there were folks who had the portfolio for education at the time, in which folks from the community, folks who wished to voice their concerns about Indigenous education and how our public school system may be responsive to that took place. And then what followed was the most fatuous discussion on the part of people seeking elected office. And it turned into something not too dissimilar than what we saw just a few days ago with the minister, instead of attempting to situate this Bill 64 in such a way that may have some value to the people of Manitoba, instead chose to attack political opponents and a union that has the interests of students in mind when they make their claims about the quality of this. So while Cullen was there basically trying to make education great again, you know, I had to consider for myself, how should I address this question? I was asked weeks ago to come on here tonight and talk about this, and I want to make some comments of a policy sort for you this evening, but I can't help to do what I do frequently, and that's to speak at some more fundamental level about the issue in question, because what's confronting us here is a situation where if you don't get the answers from Cullen, if you don't get the answers from somebody who ought to be the person responsible for putting water in the pool, right, then you have to fill in the gaps yourself sometimes, right? And here's my gap filling exercise internally here, is that this is something not to be confronted. I'm almost forced to consider that those who are crafting this legislation, those who wish to guide it in this way, are doing it in such a way that they feel is palpable for those who may elect them. It situates fiscal savings at the expense of what learning might look like in our schools and what sort of policies might be in there to support that. It is this avoidance of truth, if you will, that I think we've all seen before. I can't help but think about how many have situated this idea of honesty within conversations that really matter to us as educators, okay? I'm going to talk tonight about a lens through which we might look at policy. And maybe that's a bit grand. Maybe a more important way of situating that is saying that I want to put forth a lens for looking at Indigenous education, and in a diverse field, the field of public education, amongst others in our province, and that lens, if you will, is reconciliation. And honesty seems to be an important element to approaching reconciliation in some ways. And as David White once said, there are times when honesty lies in understanding our close and necessary relationship with not wanting to hear the truth. So when I see what's in front of me right now and the potential for how this will affect our systems of education, I can't help, I'm forced to, because nobody else is guiding me to how they're situating this themselves, to put this idea forth about why we are where we are, and where the timeline has this as early as November or maybe as late as next July, where Bill 64 is there. But I think reconciliation, that exercise in confronting truth as a means of developing a new relationship, might merit some consideration here as I begin to tell you some of the policy ideas that ought to have been considered previously. It was Murray Sinclair, former commissioner, former senator, who once put reconciliation this way. I know there's a lot of consideration and importance laid upon the calls to action. I have a great deal of time for that. It's a goal-orientated approach to that, and I've seen many schools for which there is some sort of the climate and culture is affected to some extent by reconciliation, and sometimes it's as it's in the form of those posters that we've all seen, where there's education calls to action that are laid out quite well, and that was intentional, right? You have to have some way of capturing how reconciliation may be understood, and the players, if you will, for whom those calls to action are directed, are really quite intentional too, among others, provincial governments and federal governments, right? But I come to appreciate Murray Sinclair's way of situating this when he once spoke and said that reconciliation may be understood as a means of fixing something. It may be understood as addressing these calls to action that we worked so hard on, but it is also a journey. This is an orientation approach. I just finished a course at the 7,000 level here, a master's course, and PBDE, and reconciliation. It was reconciliation in education is what it was called. And I couldn't help but have this orientation approach toward reconciliation as a means for coming to understand what's on offer here. It's a journey toward a new relationship, as he said, one in which a sense of our shared history is maintained. We can't let that history go. We know we've had some very dark ways. You know, there's a philosophy student in one of our classes who talks about that dark shadow that sometimes sits in opposition to our own daemon. We have to sort of confront the shared history that might be reflected in that shadow. And that's something for all of us, I believe, to confront. And I think the orientation approach is one where we come to understand this relationship as long-term. It is not a set of things that can be reduced to a bill, but certainly we could lay the foundations for which some change might be realized. And of course, coming into those areas, those spaces, those ethical spaces. Dwayne Donald, a professor at the University of Alberta, perhaps put it better than most when he studied and developed his Indigenous Métissage model for understanding curriculum development. If you've not explored that, please do, where he speaks of how an ethical relationality needs to be developed. And essential to that are addressing the 4 key questions that Murray puts out. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? Who am I? You've heard those before perhaps, but I think it's really important for us to sort of own up to our role. It was Jeannie and Lesley both sort of spoke directly and indirectly to this issue of responsibility toward change, responsibility toward addressing the things that we think are important. And central to that in reconciliatory frameworks are things such as this, and introducing yourself in that way. I mean, there's a reason why we go to the bother of introducing ourselves the way we do in forums such as this. So taking that forward, how may we understand a system of whatever sort to become one in which Indigenous issues, content, experiences are adequately addressed, are adequately reflected, are somehow situated in such a way that our Indigenous families and students are done well by. I've gotten to know Adam Gowdry for a while now. He's been doing some lovely work in his area, and Daniel Lawrence, a PhD student at the University of Alberta as well, has been doing some lovely work in and around understanding how indigenization might work. Indigenization, it's not a word I invoke very often, but I think we could come to understand how policies such as this can be understood or situated on this this spectrum of indigenization of some sort. And that spectrum starts at base with something they refer to as Indigenous inclusion, in which you figuratively create a space at the table, if you will. You've heard that phraseology before, where you are seeking to provide perhaps a safe space. Rai Moran, you might recall, who used to work in Manitoba, now at the University of Victoria, said essential to a reconciliatory environment in a place like an educational institution is it has to be safe. Indigenous inclusion captures some of that, but is sometimes regarded as a basic way of looking at how Indigenous people maybe become better reflected in a school's programming and such. a bit further up the levels of indigenization is reconciliation, indigenization. This is a part where they focus on a number of things. One of the important issues, one of the important features of reconciliation, indigenization is actually something approaching power sharing. Adam and Danielle go to a great deal of bother talking about how it's important for those who have authority within a politicized system, which our schools are, our school districts are, our universities are, to be situating Indigenous peoples and communities in such a way where they're not just included, but there is a measure of power and authority sharing. There are some approaches where some, and you've heard the phrase, get out of the way and let the people who know what they're doing get up to, but there is a reconciliatory spin on that because we're all involved in this exercise. And then finally, some might regard this as the most, how you say, radical of the three. Some people might paint it like this, others would say it's more necessary, is the decolonial version of indigenization. And I think many who have some important ideas about how our school system might change might pick up on something like this because it involves deconstruction. It involves imagination and better envisioning what our schools can be doing to support, amongst other people, our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students and families. Sometimes, in some ways, and I know of some principals who've done some awesome work looking at how assessment in the last little while may be better adjusted, especially within the COVID context, but outside of that as well, in order to better reflect what we've come to know about student achievement. So this is one way of framing it, and it's one that I think merits some consideration. There are other frames for looking at this, but this certainly is just one. Look, I want to speak about policy a little bit here. The most recent data that has come across my desk continues to be alarming. There are some areas of student achievement we're actually doing a little bit better, and I'm happy to see that. I'll pick up on some sort of general points and then sort of hone in on some other issues. You may have seen the most recent data nationally about Indigenous student success compared to, and it is frequently a comparative exercise, putting the total Indigenous peoples who have a certificate or diploma of some sort at 40% compared to 60% who don't. That compares to the 80-20 distribution for their non-Indigenous counterparts. So if you want to compare at that level, but there's other levels in which that might happen, the Indigenous peoples, students of Canada appear to be doing much better. The percentages of people who are acquiring their highest level of education here, a university degree or above, currently the most current data nationally has Indigenous folk having just 12% of that population having such certification, such degrees, compared to 30% for non-Indigenous counterparts. We're mostly K-12 people here, but I have to believe that our concerns for the future of our students post-graduation, their ability to contribute to our society, to their respective families and communities, kind of starts in this area of concern that is K-12 education, how that extends forward. There has been some comments on how Manitoba has been doing. There's been a series, and up till recently, it's been quite good. I hope this continues, of surveying using different methods, how student achievement has been occurring in Manitoba. Many of you may have heard the proxy cohort format. There's others, of course, that can use, but they're both equally alarming, really. The most recent release had 55% of Indigenous students had graduated in their respective four-year cohort, if you want to put it like that, compared to just a touch short of 90 for their non-Indigenous counterparts. There is an issue there. There is a problem going on there. to be specific, maybe a bit more specific, I've been doing work with one Manitoba school division for which student achievement data has been central. And there are a number of disparities, if you will. I do see some progress in many disciplinary areas where that's really quite interesting to me. It seems that there's some teachers, families, and students who are doing some awesome work in those areas. Maths and science and related areas continue to be an issue. So I think many school districts do have to begin to consider, if they are interested in student achievement at that disciplinary level, and how that might support them going forward to whatever college, university, or future that they have. That becomes very, very important. CMEC, the Council of Ministers for Education Canada, did have what I thought was a good, encouraging approach to evidence-based policy development with a specific focus on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students. It's a few years ago now, but they did pick up on this evidence-based approach in a manner in which I just explored. Student achievement, going through graduation rates, going through some of the things that they've done in order to review some of their efforts, and I think we see that all over the place. And I sometimes get into conversations with some who wonder about that focus on student achievement in that way. And that's why the Council of Ministers of Education, who had an opportunity to interface with some very learned folks, and said, okay, well, this is really quite important, but there's other important elements to understanding student achievement that's really important. They go to the bother of talking about how it's important to describe what they call outcomes and trends associated with holistic outcomes. Okay, it's a departure from student success that's reduced to grades and graduation, but it's viewed by many as an important way of doing it. It picks on so many things like values and aspirations, broader sets of goals such as health, community engagement, cultural knowledge, emotional well-being. I want to hover on that just for a moment, because a friend and colleague, Thomas Falkenberg, who's familiar to my fellow panelists, definitely, has been doing some work on the well-being way of understanding student achievement and success. And I think it's worthwhile if you wish to, if you could look that up, because it maps onto some of these issues of holistic outcome measures quite well. I don't see Melanie Janzen interrupting me, so I suspect I have lots of time left.
Frank, you don't really.
Okay. So this holistic outcome focus, that CMEC, I invite everybody to have a look at that, because when I came to understood that there was a report being developed last year or the year before, it seems like a long time ago, right? It was pre-COVID, I guess, when that was occurring, and COVID put it off. I expected to see things of this sort, looking at students and families and communities of different populations and how they may be better ministered to by our public schools. And I'm afraid that was missing there. So there's some governing principles that I'll put to you, and they're not things I'm making up. They're things that are actually publicly available, and a lot of people went to a lot of work to develop. I'll focus on one, and that was the Manitoba Collaborative Indigenous Education Blueprint. Look it up. It's a fantastic. There is a website, I think, the Manitoba Collaborative Indigenous Education Blueprint. If you come up with the acronym .ca or something like that, you'll find it. But do a Google search. Other internet search engines are available. It's based on 10 governing principles that I want to put out there, and you'll find them if you look. I'll focus on 3. Firstly, engaging with Indigenous peoples in respectful and reciprocal relationships. It goes on, but just hold on to that for a minute, because I have to wonder to what extent this government and their designates went to the bother of engaging at that level. Now, they have a plan moving forward, and that's dismantling school boards and developing some sort of appointed board to be looking at everything. We'll see how well that goes. Item 2, bringing Indigenous knowledge, languages, and intellectual traditions, models, and approaches into curriculum and pedagogy. These are the sort of things that address some of the concerns that we have. And you need not make an invocation of Indigenous peoples to make this robust. This can be important to everybody, right? And this blueprint's been out there. There's many signatories, including some in public education. Have a look. And then one final one, increasing and measuring Indigenous school and post-secondary participation success rates, looking at the end goal, looking how we are doing post-graduation and taking this as CMEC addressed an evidence-based approach to this. So look, we have a policy in front of it, might be law soon. I have to believe that policy and law ought to be reflective of our ethics, or at least our proto-ethics. And if we don't hold our government account to address these things that really matter and affect our families and our children in this way, who knows where we'll be in the future. So look, Nyalagoa, thank you. I probably went over, but I talk a lot, so Ona.
Thank you, Frank. I think that you raised some important points also about what's missing in the bill. And I think about in the 327 pages, the word Indigenous and the word reconciliation are each only mentioned one time. And that's both in relation to Indigenous student achievement, as if that's just Indigenous kids' problem. And there's no mention of Indigenous education, reconciliation, Indigenous language rights, understanding of treaties. None of this is present in the bill in regards to curriculum, policy, or indeed power sharing that you talk about and spoke about as well. So thank you for raising those concerns. I think they're all important. I want to just go to, I'm going to share my screen for 1 second before we go to the Q&A, because I want to just highlight a couple of things that are coming up. Oopsie, don't need to see all of that, I suppose. There we go. I have so many windows open. I'm managing too many things here. Sorry. Okay, so just a couple in the chat, there a few people had asked about other sources of information in regards to Bill 64. I want to remind you that all of these forums are being recorded and will be on our faculty's YouTube channel. And Tamara, I think put the chat or the link to that in the chat. Also that there's a website being developed currently entitled Inform Ed. And this is a collaboration between the various universities in Manitoba in order to provide researcher-informed perspectives on issues related to public education, particularly Bill 64. The Manitoba Teacher Society has an awesome toolkit online for how you can engage in understanding and taking action against Bill 64, as does the Manitoba School Boards Association. The Manitoba Association of Parent Councils is also taking action, and you can find that on their website. Please note that the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives did a forum a couple of weeks ago. It's on their YouTube channel and it's excellent. And what they did that's different than what's happening with these other organizations is that they engaged people from across the country who have had similar reforms imposed on their education system. And so they take this opportunity to hear from folks in Alberta, Ontario, and in Nova Scotia to hear about their experiences and the ways in which they tried to counter some of the reform, neoliberal, and oppressive policies of these bills. And also the Louis Riel School Division Board of Trustees held a community conversation a couple of weeks ago. And one of the highlights for me was the grade 9 students who did a critical analysis of Bill 64, and that's posted on their YouTube channel. There was also an excellent parent presentation in that hour-long conversation, as well as Dr. John Ween. So there are some other sources of information, so I just wanted to respond to those questions in the chat. And now one more thing, sorry, I think I had one more thing. There are some actions that folks can take that was also in the chat. And one person in the chat was asking, aside from making a presentation, are there other actions? And, you know, obviously being informed is one of them. I think there's many, many facets to this bill that we need to learn about and consider, and how they will affect not just us individually, but our community as a whole. I encourage you to reach out to any of the presenters here or any of the organizations that are listed, ask questions and join coalitions. Of course, you can write to your MLA, the Minister of Education, and the Minister of the Opposition. And you can make a presentation and hopefully join us for upcoming webinars. That's my little plug. Okay, so let's stop the screen share now and let's just go. We've got some time for some questions. I'm hoping the panelists could join me here with the video so it feels less like I'm just talking to myself. Thank you, awesome. Okay, so here's a question. We've talked a lot about some things that are missing, and maybe by way of contrast, and this question, I'm going to start with you, Jeannie, because you talked a lot about the poverty issue, as did you, Lesley, so we'll go to that as well. We talked a lot about what's missing in regards to issues about acknowledging issues of poverty, racial inequality, settler colonialism. If it was up to you, what would you like to see more of in the bill? What would be an important addition to be adding to the bill at this particular time in our globalized society and in our settler colonial presence?
The number one thing is community engagement. Communities have experienced what's wrong with the education system as it is. So if they're the ones who can tell us really from their lived experience what they would like to see. And I think those partnerships, the bridging between people with expertise in education and people with expertise in the community, and all of the entangled complex issues that come together. So the research I've been doing with Dr. Yoon has really reinforced in both of our minds that you can't improve what goes on in education without improving what's going on in the community, and hearing from the community about what that has to be. So we have to link those explicitly. And I think the government and Bill 64 is really segregating education from all of the societal things it's linked to, and saying we're going to improve things by just looking at this, but this thing is embedded in something bigger and with a long history. And yeah, so we have to pull it together. We have to get to the community. And I think you know, the community schools part, you know, that's been a great initiative, and I saw that completely diluted in this. It's down to a paragraph, and there's nothing in there about, oh, like, you know, there's no funding, it's all grants, and these are suggestions. It should be so crystal clear what a community school should be funded to do and how it integrates with the community, because that's the whole point of it. So I think that would be my first thing.
Thank you, Jeannie. Lesley?
I would add to what Jeannie said. I think community engagement is incredibly important. And I think in order to do that, you need to have the trust of the community. And I feel that right now that doesn't exist. I think there is an impression or a perspective that the government is operating independently, and there needs to be increased consultation with community members. I would say that as someone who is involved in student services for over 30 years, and working with kids with additional needs, it's important that we engage with parents and families, that we engage with issues around the number of kids that are in care. And I agree with Jeannie when she said, you know, what does care actually look like? Certainly not what is occurring right now. And so that engagement needs to happen, as well as engagement with those that are that have experience and knowledge in education, including our teachers. And I feel like there has to be a rapport and a respect and an ongoing dialogue happening with our teachers in the classrooms in schools, and with administrators, with our superintendents and our boards. And that there are a number of organizations in Manitoba that work together, and we all work together well. Manitoba is unique in North America in terms of the relationships that they have with the organizations. And in education, we all work together uniquely well. And unfortunately, what is happening within this bill is that is being destroyed. And that is also destroying the trust that has been established, and it's destroying the way that Manitoba works as opposed to other communities across North America, and that is unfortunate. So I really think we have to think about what we're moving forward with here.
Yeah, I think a really good example of that aspect of collaboration between various groups in Manitoba that you talked about, Lesley, that is so unique in North America would be the ways in which, for example, the Manitoba Association of School Superintendents and the Manitoba Teacher Society, so arguably employer and employee roles, collaborate on things like human rights conferences every year, right? That there is a very collaborative, productive working relationship between those two organizations. And for folks who don't know, one of the things that will happen in this bill is that the principals will be removed from the union, the superintendents will be abolished, the teacher society, or sorry, teachers become employees of the minister's office. It's the relationships between all of these organizations that actually work quite well collaboratively for the sake of children. All of those relationships will be undermined and reorganized, it seems like, by into a bureaucracy that could be very detrimental. Frank, did you want to add anything about what you think is, you know, if you had your druthers, what would you add to the bill that's not currently there? The question was originally in relation to poverty, but anything that is on top of your mind?
So there's lots, and I suppose I could cherry pick things. I will sort of be somewhat selfish in regard to how I reflect my own work. There's been a great deal of effort over the last few years in bringing languages alive in the classroom, okay? There are people who are exploring Anishinaabe, Cree, Métis in some quarters, to such a great extent, and some have a long legacy of that. If you ever have an opportunity to visit some of the schools in Mystery Lake, wow, they're doing some things, and they are concerned with the resources that they have and the teacher population, but they frankly is something for us to shoot for, and protection of aspects of Indigenous cultural identity of various sorts is something that people are beginning to consider and embrace, and some provinces are doing better than others in that area. Some districts are taking a strong stance in that area. I think it is unfortunate that a province such as Manitoba, which has such a strong representation of Indigenous peoples and families, communities of a variety of different backgrounds, and that's not captured in here. That's a travesty. It's awful. And some of the things that we've spoken about, you know, I think the window for action is closing somewhat. I hope people don't mind me waxing kind of disappointing in that way. But someone is in the media recently talking of their late father, saying something that was really inspirational, and said, you know, it's not enough to be right. You also have to be effective. Now, I'm not one to be of the activist sort, but there are some who are prepared to organize in this way, and I think we should be carrying on with that. My friend Cheryl is in this here, and I could see her talking about joining some of what's going on here. So it's something that if you care about this, then we go to the effort to make our opinions known, right? And even in this day and age where we have such a interesting, I'll put it that, sort of much charitably, conservative government at the helm, even they can't necessarily overlook a strong public voice on something so important. So I think we need to sort of be as reactive, and it's a shame we're being reactive, but there you are, but we need to so much.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. There's a number of people in the chat and in the Q&A encouraging all of the panelists to be using their presentation as their presentation to the Legislative Bill Committee. And lots of chatter in the chat also about encouraging others. There's over 200 people here tonight. There was over 800 people registered at our last forum. Any of you on social media know that there's quite a bit of activity on social media, on Twitter and in Facebook. So for those of you who are interested in being involved, please do reach out, get active, and do make a presentation. Currently, I think the current number is over 400 presentations scheduled to the Bill Committee, which I understand is the most ever in the history of Manitoba. So I think that speaks to the impression that folks have and the urgency that people are feeling, and also to the minister's response this week about the vocal minority making such a mess of his plans. So obviously it's getting some attention, and I would encourage us to continue on with that. There's so many questions, and I'm not sure. Someone wants to have coffee with you, Frank. There's some links in the chat of all sorts of things. Here's one question that maybe we'll end with that I think is an important one. One of our Q&A questions is asking about the trauma that has been faced by Indigenous people, and the ways that it appears that this is being accounted for in Bill 64 through a greater engagement of families. Does anyone want to speak to the perception of the greater engagement of parents and family knowledge that is allocated in Bill 64 or made space for? Jeannie, go ahead. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's just a diversionary tactic by saying, you've thrown open the gates to allow participation, and that miraculously the group that's been most excluded from all conversations will take that space up. There's so many barriers that are going on already, even in terms of the forums and how they're conducted, and yeah, like it's just really all the systems are designed to welcome a Euro-Western kind of framework and response, and it's not honored like how you would make relationships and making those ways. That takes a lot of time, and there's fundamental distrust by well-founded distrust by Indigenous parents with the school systems and the education systems and the government. And so how they think that everybody's just going to be able to take that up when you're living under, and this is definitely not for all Indigenous people, but overwhelmingly a number of Indigenous people in Manitoba are, dealing with all kinds of the effects of settler colonialism in terms of, just having the energy and time to go to these spaces. Like that's a luxury, that's a privilege. And so how can somebody who's working 2 or 3 jobs now go sit on the panel and do all that work and be the voice, when your experience of that is that your voice has been appropriated, misused, and used as a strategy to get another agenda put through? So I don't see that really being genuine in terms of an invitation. And I think it's a way to make it look like, oh, see, we invited, but they didn't come, right? So I don't.
Yeah. And I think structurally, it's important to remember that the Parent Advisory Council, which will be made up of 1 rep from each region, Winnipeg will only be allowed 1 representative, although they have 100,000 students that one person will represent. And so I think that's an important distinction, right? That where is the space for true voice representation and community input if Winnipeg is now represented by only 1 parent? So I think these are important considerations, the structure that's being imposed. I think it's time to draw our evening to a close. I'd like to thank you, Frank, Jeannie, and Lesley, for your time. I'd like to thank our universities, the University of Manitoba Faculty of Education and the University of Winnipeg Faculty of Education, and the staff who support these events and make it all happen. And also the university's commitment to speaking out alongside parents, trustees, and teachers. We stand with you. And we hope we can together really rally to make a change and to influence the ways in which this bill is being imposed. So I encourage you to reach out to whichever organization you feel comfortable doing so, to any of us or any other colleagues. We're happy to help and to work with you. Thank you all for your time tonight. Merci, miigwech. We'll see you next time, June 24th.